So everybody, thank you very much for joining our webcast today. I really appreciate it. This one is kind of a fun webcast because we wanted to get you in kind of the mindset of the vulnerability that Jordan discovered, and Jordan's going to walk us through that. And as we go through this, I want you to think, how could you approach your own security assessments with your own cloud infrastructures and the components that you're utilizing to kind of find these same types of underlining vulnerabilities. So we'll be constantly coming back to that as an overall theme. As always, you got Jordan is on Twitter, Rev10D, so go ahead and follow him. And I'm at StrandJS, and our website is blackhillsinfosec.com, and we're also on Twitter at BHInfoSecurity. So please check it out. So let's go ahead and let's go to the next slide, Jordan, and do a little bit of level setting. So the cloud is interesting. I hear a lot of people talking about cloud security issues. And unfortunately, whenever most people are looking at cloud security issues, they look at it from the perspective of open S3 buckets, and that's about it. Of course, the recent breach, I think it was Capital One, had some interesting things associated with it as well. But I think that oversimplifies the issue of what we're going to be dealing with whenever it comes to cloud computing and cloud security. So with cloud, one of the things that's great is you can deploy multiple technologies very quickly. And containers are part of this as well, because you have technologies like Docker that make it super easy to stand up a whole bunch of technologies in one nice stack, and it's all configured, ready to rock and roll, and then you can take that down and scale it up as you need. But that's simplified from a deployment and operational perspective is going to create problems. And that's going to be one of the things that Jordan's going to talk about here starting on the next slide as well, is whenever you have that type of container stack that can be built with multiple different components, especially open source components. Sometimes those open source components will have critical vulnerabilities in them. Sometimes those open source components may come in with default configurations. So a lot of the same types of security issues that we'd see with traditional technologies actually continue to manifest themselves when we're dealing with clouds as well. So what is deployed and how it's scaled is absolutely essential. So for this webcast, as we go through, I'd like everyone to focus on the process, how these vulnerabilities were discovered, the stack that was being put up, and doing that level of research, not the specific details, because we don't want to have a webcast where we're basically telling people, here's how you exploit this specific vulnerability. Instead, there's a much larger lesson that can be learned when you're looking at cloud infrastructures, especially when you're dealing with scaling and lots of technologies being hobbled together and working. Underlining complexity issues. And remember, complexity is ultimately the enemy of computer security. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jordan, and I'm going to continue to assist with questions. If you have any questions, as it is with almost every Black Hills Information Security webcast, please type your questions in. We have a number of people, I think we have 6 people here right now that will help answer questions as they come up. And we will be watching those very closely, and we'll try to answer as many as we possibly can. So with that, Jordan, I'm going to hand it over to you, sir.
John, thanks for the intro. Brilliant. My cat's trying to step on my keyboard here, so fair enough. As John said, yeah, lots of interesting things happen in the cloud these days. Cat, you're going to get me in big trouble in this webcast. We already skipped a slide, 2. So basically, where we are is dealing with cloud. Somehow, some way, I landed in a service we had not yet mapped. Sorry about that. So we recognize that AWS, that Google Cloud, that Azure, that these markets may be underserved from a security perspective. So we designed something to kind of fit those needs, where we could come in, we could begin an audit process against your cloud infrastructure, we could scan things, and we try to map it to a traditional pen test in that there's an internal and an external surface. And in these lengthy conversations with Mike Felch over the last week, we've come to the realization that nothing in the cloud is traditional, right? So there's no internal traditional pen test. There's no traditional external pen test. But we do ask similar things like, okay, what is your external IP range? What is your internal IP range? Oh, you do serverless architecture, you don't really rely on IP addresses? all right, then maybe we should look at your lambdas. Maybe we should look at some of the functions and try to understand what you're actually doing in the cloud. So in doing so, we've developed relationships with some entities who ask us to come in and audit their stuff like we always do. And in that light, we had some interesting discoveries kind of early on in this process of BHIS building its own kind of cloud testing platform. There's a lot of services you can click once to deploy, and you get this beautiful stack of services. But really what happens is we miss these documents that tell us about how the thing is deployed, the services that get exposed, the actual functioning of it. We just say, oh, hey, we need to process data. So we search data processing, and you find these engines that do data processing. And here we end up. Open source solutions packaged together in a cobbled sort of way that expose your organization to the potential for risk, right? We can't call it a 0 day. It's not a 0 day. People know that these clusters execute code. So execution of code is not a vulnerability. It's a risk, right? And it's a risk that you have to take seriously, very seriously in this case. So we identified a couple things working with the customer. We reported those things to Amazon. They weren't really interested from a support perspective. They said, go read the documentation, implement it properly. So we had a couple months off in this while we tried to figure out if the ticket was worth, pursuing. And we determined that, okay, we are seeing these more and more. I think even Kelsey had a test recently where specifically EMR popped up. And guess what we do? We go find the EMR install, we exploit it, we get shells. This is just how it works. So we're going to get to the technologies, but anyway, timelines are here, right? We have an NDA with AWS, so
Yep.
we reported
I
this
think,
to the security team.
yep. And I was going to say, I think that shows one of the fundamental differences whenever you're dealing with the company is trying to get plugged into the right people. Because I think support wasn't that great, but once we started talking to the security team was cracking.
Oh,
Those guys were
absolutely.
amazing to work with. They
Yeah,
treated it as a partnership. It was absolutely one of the
exactly.
coolest things ever.
Everything, yeah, everything you expect. And he talks about how they keep track of us, right? And they keep track of all the security stuff going on in industry because that's their function and role, understanding vulnerabilities and sharing, right? So the security team at AWS is amazing. I'm going to give a shout out to Zach. He may be here. He may have sent his minions to keep track of us. But again, we have an NDA, so there are certain things we can't say, right? This is
Yep.
definitely not Amazon's fault, right? There is
So people are
nothing
already asking
in
what
vulnerability.
EMR is. People are already asking what EMR is. Don't worry, we're going to talk about Elastic Map Reduce here in
Yep.
just a couple of seconds.
So
So
we just wanted to
there
talk
you
about
go.
the timelines. That's a very broad overview of these discoveries, right? And here we are. So Hadoop, MapReduce, what is this? These are basically data processing engines. All of the cloud providers have them in one form or another. And why do they do that? Because these cloud providers can ingest data at such rapid rates that our traditional on-premise networks could be, in theory, overwhelmed. Imagine processing location data for cell phones, right? Someone is doing that. They need big data processing engines, both bandwidth, muscle flexing capacity, right, in CPU, in disk, and we can't do that as well in traditional infrastructure as you can in the cloud. So these services were designed to handle those gigantic data ingests. So what is MapReduce? What is Hadoop, right? MapReduce is a programming model, and it relies on open source technologies to do these things, right? Filter and sort. We're going to map the data. What do we have? Then we summarize that data, reduce it. EMR, Elastic MapReduce, then pushes that around a cluster via jobs. So Hadoop is essentially a distributed data processing framework. So all that makes sense. Any questions, John? Did I gloss over anything there?
Yep, I think that it's just, it's not just data processing, but whenever you talk about people and organizations that are doing big data analytics and they're doing it in the cloud, then an elastic MapReduce instance is one of those things that they can absolutely use to achieve those goals. And every one of the vendors that Jordan was just talking about make it very, very, very easy to stand that big data processing up and get it running very quickly.
So then the Hadoop framework itself, right? EMR MapReduce relies on a framework of open source software. So what we see here is a list of services. While this list is extensive, we picked out 2 due to vulnerabilities we discovered, right? The
And
Yet
this
Another
also,
Resource Navigator. Go
yep,
ahead.
and this list is not exhaustive. There's some more things that are part of the EMR cluster that are not listed here, but these are the major ones.
Yep, exactly. So the ones we picked out here are or contain some kind of vulnerability that we demonstrated a way to use the product to get access to an internal virtual private cloud. Just got coffee delivered. High five. Thank you. But anyway, Hue contains a very interesting one. If you're paying attention on that first slide, it contains a new user experience exposure or exposure experience. When you fire up a Hue interface, it waits for it, asks you to configure that initial admin user. There's a blog on this. I think that went out in the initial webcast sign up. But Yarn also used to have an RCE Metasploit module 100% effective every time because the Yarn interface did not require authentication. You could quickly drop a 1-line remote shell callback in it. So this thing would just process. Now we're going to get more into the vulnerabilities, but these things come up essentially unprotected. There's no authentication, there's no authorization requirements. They are essentially waiting for you to do whatever it is you do to protect your organization when you deploy new software. So policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines should be mapped from your current on-premise network to a cloud map prior to going to the cloud, right? People are overlooking how they map data currently to this now extremely non-traditional infrastructure where you cannot wrap your arms around things, where you cannot see an installation. You don't have to go through Ganglia prereq installations or Uzi, installation stuff. You click a button, which we will here very soon, and it all comes up beautifully. And then we can break that stuff unless you are deploying it with AWS. Has some amazing options for securing these features at this point. You can do Kerberos, so if any of your Elastic MapReduce instances come up, you can immediately require that they are enforced authorization via Kerberos. So you do domain authorization, federated Active Directory, or you can use Amazon's Active Directory services, which are, again, non-traditional Active Directory infrastructure to secure these services prior to them coming online. However, we are only looking at a very small subset of one service. I believe at this point, Amazon, Google, Oracle, Azure are in the 4,000 to 5,000 unique services range. So this is one service, one thing we can do. But anyway, questions while I bring up our AWS interface here?
So far, no real comments on it, but I will say that anytime anyone has a cat, it seems to make everyone in the webcast lose their minds about the cat. They're like, we want to see the cat.
Isn't that how the internet works?
Yeah, isn't that how the internet works, right? So Jordan, you're kind of going through and standing up a stack right now, right?
Yeah, it's just amazing how simple it is. Oh, EMR is rolled in the last 1 day. So we're gonna go with yesterday's release just because I know this demo will work, right? Click. Okay, one thing, I disabled logging, which you should not. We'll talk about some more things you should do in AWS when you deploy services later. But
And we're
anyway, we
kind
go
of
to the
running,
M1 medium because we want to
yeah,
keep our bills small.
and we're kind of running this basically to show people how quick and easy it is to shoot yourself in the foot, right?
And that's it. Click, done,
Yeah.
coming up. So that'll be up in 5 or 7 minutes, and we'll revisit that here shortly.
Great. So now we're vulnerable.
Oh, not quite yet. Yeah, it's got to come online first, and then yes, we will be vulnerable indeed. So let's go back to our PowerPoint slide deck. We'll talk some more about the technologies behind it.
While that cooks in the oven.
Yeah, if you thought data processing was hard, oh boy, have I got a surprise for you. Anyway, we'll get to some of the interfaces, what they can do, and how they work. But some basic terminology. An EC2 instance is a DigitalOcean node. It's a cloud computer. It's a chunk of disk with some resources where you can do things. Security group. This is where you go down to your instance level, your EC2 instance, and you can configure some firewalls. Think of a security group as a host-based firewall. CloudWatch. This is a neat feature in that I can define some infrastructure monitoring sets, like if my CPU gets pegged, I want you to do a thing. If my memory is out of capacity, I want you to do a thing. Disk size, I hit 75% on disk, give me a new auto-scaled instance. Now, John highlighted this in red after going through. This is very important. Auto-scaling can be an exceptionally dangerous feature, and it contributes to this vulnerability risk, what have you, generally speaking. So every time you spin a new EMR cluster or your quote unquote auto scaling rules, which trigger on CloudWatch monitoring, guess what? We get a new vulnerable cluster, right?
So yeah, the analogy I always like to use is whenever you use auto scaling, you're going to spin up instances as it's required to handle the load, and it'll spin down, and that actually saves your company money. But if you want an analogy, this is very much like an accordion that has a hole in it, because I've been listening to a lot of Weird Al Yankovic over the past couple of weeks. But as the accordion pulls out, there's holes that are inside of that accordion, and then whenever it closes down, those holes may actually go away. So that will highlight, you're going to see why that's important here in a little bit, but sometimes when things scale up, it introduces no vulnerabilities that wouldn't be there in your base default baseline configuration when you did your first security assessment. So go ahead.
Yeah, and let's talk about that new user experience exposure. Every single new cluster comes up waiting and asking for a new admin user, right? A new Hue admin user. We will see what you can do with that kind of further down in the slide deck, but again, scaling. It's an amazing technology to save you money, to make sure you have enough resources to complete your whatever you're doing in the cloud. And I mean, it presents a unique risk that's hard to handle. One, if you're not reading your documentation, you're not implementing security properly, and you can just leave yourself vulnerable and not even know it. So this was yesterday.
Well,
John
we
and I
gotta,
also discussed this at length. We did not expose the search you have to do.
well, and a couple of things. A question that we just had pop up: how come Amazon doesn't fix this? And I think Amazon is doing as much as they can to protect people, but when you're standing up these different stacks, you should, I guess, let me boil it down very, very simply. You should not expect Amazon security team to be your security team. It is not their roles and responsibilities to go through and try to secure absolutely everyone's instances. That is not their role. So I would not think of it in terms of this is Google or Amazon or Azure's problem per se. You're
They
still going to be
also,
responsible for securing your
their,
stuff.
their security model is very explicit about this. They have security, I think it's called on the cloud and in the cloud. They've got security baked in for the things they're responsible for. Things like their physical security. They've got a large share of this, but that doesn't mean you can't mess it up, and that's your responsibility. And
Yeah,
that's
in the
typical
shared
of any.
responsibility model, they are responsible for physical security, disk operations, and giving you the space you need to perform layer 2 through 7, not physical, right? It is not their responsibility to configure your software. It is your responsibility to do gap analysis, to scan your infrastructure, to make sure you are hiring people that know how to do those things, right? If you are in the cloud and you have no idea what cloud security is, you need to take a step back and consider the decisions you've made as an organization. Again,
Well,
if you haven't mapped cloud policies from your previous on-prem, you're probably in trouble because you don't know how to configure accounts with standard password policies based on your on-prem networks. It does not map directly. You can't say, oh, hey, John, let's fix Active Directory by increasing our password length. Unless you have federated services authenticating you to your cloud resources, it does not map. You need a new password policy, right? And this is just the basics. There's so far to go from traditional on-prem to non-traditional cloud operations. So this list is something, if you're going to screenshot something and you're going to hand your executives, these are things you need to understand. Yesterday, 724 Hue interfaces were exposed to the internet. Now, not all these are vulnerable. Some people may have gap analysis procedures or protections in place to keep them from exposing the new user service. However, I would assume 30–50% of these are probably waiting for new user configuration.
I actually plugged around a little bit, and I would probably say it's closer to 60 to 70. But even at that, it changes, right? Like we've seen that number as low as 400. We've seen it as high as 900. It's basically moving up and down as scaling is required. So.
That is exactly accurate, and brings up a point I may have glossed over. This is not just Amazon. It is not just Google Cloud, not just Oracle, China Unicom. These services who take EMR, package, and then sell you a slice of their pie, right, for data processing. These are all cloud providers that are coming up with a very similar risk. Now, again, understanding that risk, how do we get from where you are spinning services to you are protecting your services? We go to traditional pen testing. Now you can go through your logic of scanning and enumeration. You can go through a standard Nessus scan. The next slide, we're going to talk about EyeWitness. We've got our XML file with URLs. We can do these things that we do in traditional pen tests against non-traditional infrastructure once you've figured out kind of the basics of securing, launching, understanding, mapping policies. You do not want to start with us in your network if you haven't gone through some of these basic things like deploying policies, sharing knowledge, or educating your staff on cloud. It's a very dangerous proposition to push to the cloud if you have not invested in your people. So anything else? Am I glossing over that too much?
So I want to go back to that Nessus thing and kind of drive that home. That's a Nessus scan as it stood up. So you've got PHP unsupported versions, unsupported web server detection, default files. I think the Tomcat administrative page is exposed. There's all kinds of things that it's standing up. So just because it makes it quote unquote easy to stand this up doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually secure out of the gate. But I will stress there's very little from this, correct me if I'm wrong, Jordan, that's like, oh, we can just exploit that directly out of the gate. There's you have to dig a little bit deeper.
No, I couldn't get the XSS to work. I think it was Nessus saying, oh, hey, I saw a script that I dropped in a URL reflected in the response and it was a 401 or something. And so yeah, there's nothing directly exploitable here. That does not mean that there's not things you would immediately go investigate. But again, yeah. So then again, we run EyeWitness. What does that give us? EyeWitness goes, this is a fantastic tool, by the way. Next slide gives the love that's deserved. Goes and screenshots all the URLs that are associated with web services from the XML file. You can formulate your URLs any way you want. It's just easy for us to use the output of a Nessus file. This can ingest the XML it produces. We go gather those screenshots, then we start clicking through and seeing what's interesting in the output. So, kind of described previously, Twitter hugs for 40 North Security. If you don't know who they are, it's time to go check. Is that a 40 or a FORTY? Did I get that right, John?
I think it's for FORTY.
Okay, cool. Anyway, 40 North Security. Chris is a fan of ours. We're a fan of his, and it's a good relationship for us all. So then we see some things in our EyeWitness tool output, right? What did we get here? Tomcat administrative page, sitting, waiting. Now, is it default credentials? Probably not, because Tomcat now requires that you go configure a file and drop credentials in there. That does not mean that this is not an exposure you should be interested in. Does it need to be exposed? No. Should it be? Probably not.
I also think I look at things like this as kind of a cattle call for attackers. If an organization has this kind of default Apache page, it usually is telling people that, hey, there's actually some, this is probably an organization that doesn't have a good solid policy, and it will attract attackers. It's like chum in the internet. It's basically going to bring people you don't want coming to your network.
That's brilliant. Yeah, again, and what is important here? Let's just summarize. We spun a new cluster. We had the intention of processing data. We scanned it. We've identified some things. We've gathered some screenshots. We got a pretty good sense of what's going on, right? So here's some more stuff. The Hadoop cluster, sitting waiting to tell you all kinds of interesting things. The Hive server. I'm not familiar with Hive, don't know what it is or does, but here's a whole screen of things that it looks like it's interested in looking at, right? SQL queries probably.
And this is all just screenshots that EyeWitness takes, right?
Yep.
It's not necessarily a vulnerability scan, but it's taking screenshots of those web apps and then displaying it so it's easy for you to look and find these without it coming back as a zero day or a critical vulnerability. It's like, oh crap, they have a bunch of configuration pages exposed.
Exactly. And here's the first time we see our Hue new user exposure experience. So we intentionally did not expose the URL because it could, in theory, get people on the internet in trouble. This is a serious, serious risk. If you are doing anything with big data in the cloud, go review your infrastructure. If you want, John, how do you feel? Like, can people DM us for investigations? We did not want to expose the systems on the internet to this risk.
I would say if people are running this, if they shot us an email directly, we could absolutely share it. We probably will share it a little bit later after people get some time. But the issue that Jordan and I were wrestling with is we're talking about this vulnerability as it exists. The Shodan URL will basically show you all of the systems that are wide open to be exploited. And we might release that. It's not hard to piece together, by the way, from what we have right here. But just know that there's a number of systems that are vulnerable.
And again, this is something going on inside these clusters, right? It comes up, you can create directories, you can create files, you can upload files. They're all unauthenticated. They're all waiting to be interacted with. So they don't come up necessarily exposed to the internet. You probably needed to make some mistakes before this. However, we test internal infrastructure similar. Imagine compromise. Someone clicks a link, they have VPN'd into your VPCs. This stuff is exposed. So, while it's not directly intentionally exposed to the internet, it can be exposed to your infrastructure. So let's check on our cluster, see if that came online.
I think it's up.
Yeah, it looked like it was bootstrapping, but we'll take a quick look here. You guys are going to see some public IPs.
Please don't attack them during our webcast. Like,
yeah, right.
We're always amazed at how quickly you people break into stuff. You're like, oh wow, look, Jordan showed me an IP address. I've got shell.
John, what do you mean, you people?
Hackers.
Oh, fair. Okay, so this is the one we're interested in right here. Oh, my bad, wrong way. All right, good time for question and answer.
So, and I'll just kind of run through some things. So basically where we're at right now is, if you start with just a standard Nessus scan, there's some concerning things in the scan report, but there's nothing that looks like an absolute smoking gun that you will be able to break into this organization. And years ago, we did a series of webcasts on how to leverage medium and low vulnerabilities to gain access to environments without having that exploit in your quiver when you're attacking. And that actually started, even before that, started with Chris Gates and Karnal Onage had a number of really good blog posts talking about how you could find lower level vulnerabilities and then leverage those vulnerabilities to actually attack those systems. So that's kind of where we're at, right? You have the basic vulnerability scan comes back. It says there's some concerning things. And many auditors and testers would basically just kind of submit that as the report. But good firms, if you're looking at like Trusted Second and Guardians, Secure Ideas, Rendition, a number of great firms, they'll actually dig in deeper. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. So Jordan, oh God, okay, so you're already there. I'll hand it back over to you.
Yep, here we go. And we'll run our ELF
Wait,
malware.
can you back up? Can you back up how you got
Oh, yeah,
here?
totally.
Yeah, so this looks like it's stupid easy because it is. So this is the Hue instance that you just stood up, just like 5 or 20 minutes ago, and you were able to come direct. How did you get into this Hue interface where you can actually get into the editor and everything?
This is our new user experience, and I'm going to show a screenshot because there's a little trouble here. But oh, good morning, PowerPoint. Thank you. Let's go back here. Oh, I'm clicking the wrong button. So again, this is our new user experience exposure window right here. We add our user, we log into the interface.
But it starts up like that. Like as soon as you surf to the Hue interface, it pops up and it says, hey,
Yep.
you're a new user. You haven't created an admin account. That's okay. Just type in a user ID and a password, and I'll automatically create that account for you by
Yes.
default from the exposed web interface. And then you get to this. And this is
And
the
then
part
so
that just
now
blew
we're
my
in as
mind
Hue
earlier.
admin. Yeah, exactly. And in our editor, right, look at all these fun things we can do. We've got Python. We'll talk about these in a little bit. There's screenshots here, kind of back up some of this stuff. Shell, you want to run Shell, you want to run Java, all that stuff is amazing. And here we are under editor and Shell.
I think it's very interesting that the Hue interface just basically has the ability that you can upload a shell command. So
Yeah, and it's not even that difficult, right? Generate some super duper malware with our Metasploit, right? And we talk about this as not being interesting, right? We don't want to care about Metasploit. That's not the
well,
point.
and we don't want to find these types of vulnerabilities. I think when you found this, you were pretty excited on the engagement that you were on. And I think that excitement faded fairly quickly when you realized that this was a systematic issue. It wasn't just a one single customer issue. So,
And so we basically define where the script sits, what we want it to run. We click this little play button over here. It does the thing. We go and sit at our shell, our multi-handler, and hopefully that comes in, right? And what we get is an interpreter, which you don't want out of your infrastructure.
but it's nice that it gives you that ability to actually get interpreter shells, for a pen tester, I suppose. So do we want to let this cook for a couple of seconds and we could, oh, there it is. So basically what Jordan just did is he was able to upload a Linux binary, and he was able to have the Hue interface automatically execute that Linux binary as part of a job. And now he has access to that system. And all of that basically boils down to it shouldn't have been this easy. And it, by default, comes up this way. Once again, the Nessus scan doesn't actually bring the doesn't bring this type of vulnerability to the forefront because it's actually a multitude of different things that have issues. And there you are. Cool. All right.
So that's that from a very high level overview. We're going to go through it again just because it's important and we have slides for it, right? So again, new user experience exposure. This is the front end of Hue here in the screen on the left, right? We have a file browser. We have the privilege to upload. We can schedule tasks. We can execute code. What's really cool is we can schedule our interpreter shell to continually execute and send shells out of eventually all nodes in a given cluster, right? New cluster comes online, reinfect, new entirely compromised cluster. And this gives us access, right? We can do things like route add. Now we have a tunnel into your VPCs, right? This is a gigantic risk, but not Amazon's problem, not Google's problem, not Oracle's problem. This is a problem of gap analysis, policy procedure, and implementing your code in a secure manner. So what is Hue, right? Dynamic dashboards, data visualizations, all these cool things. But what we see on the right is it also contains gigantic data sets. And this is, from my perspective, the most important part of this. If you're not securing these services, you are likely exposing your entire data sets in very risky ways. And depending on your data sets, in this case, we just have customer IDs, but again, it could be cell phone location data, could be banking customer ingests, web browsing history, things that people really don't want you to expose, and in the EU can get you into gigantic financial trouble. So again, we're going to just walk through the shell process again, so it's really clear how easy it is. New user experience, create user. Create a container, push things into the container, right? Editor, look at all these things we can
This is
do.
my
I did
favorite.
not investigate jar. I did not investigate Java, but I was able to get shells with Python and shell, right? Meterpreter and reverse bash via Python. So for those of you who have time to spend, probably go execute some jar code, right? Web shells out all day. Java, who knows what kind of fun you can have. Generate up some handlers, do this stuff. Oh, look at my animation.
There you go.
So the whole process. Do we need to take a step back here and a deep breath together? Is this as bad as it looks, John, or am I crazy?
I think that there's a couple of things, right? I think that one of the things that is concerning to me is whenever I'm talking to a number of the different cloud security vendors that are out there, these types of vulnerabilities, they don't seem to be addressing. I mean, if a vulnerability hits the news, like I talk about S3 buckets, and that hits the news all the time. They're getting really good at basically trying to shut those types of things down. And like these types of core configuration issues and checking patches, they aren't doing as well as I'd like them to do.
Mm.
The other concern that I have, and this is consistent, is almost every single time that we're going into a test with an organization that is using something like Amazon and they're using something like Azure, we're finding these types of vulnerabilities with less than a week of research. With this one, I would say, is this about a week, Jordan, or was this like a couple of days for you
Yeah,
to
we're
pull this
time
all
boxed
together?
as always.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
So,
I think we had 4 full days with a customer.
yeah. So the concept and the reason why I think that this webcast was important, why we would go with it, is one, I wanted to show kind of the mindset of how you would go from that high level scan all the way to where you can get access to it. And that is probably the biggest deal about this, is almost every time we look at something that's cloud-based, it doesn't take very much time and we find some very scary things. But I think that that is because of the complexity. Going back to the first slide that I was talking on at the beginning of this webcast, is these cloud infrastructures take the incredibly complicated and they make it super easy to deploy. And by doing that, we had a number of people that typed in chat, they're just giving you enough rope to hang yourself in many situations. And there's that exception, or there's that expectation that you're going to have shared responsibility for securing your stuff. Now, the crux of all of this long rambling diatribe that I'm going on is many organizations that gravitate towards cloud are gravitating towards cloud because they do not have the technical resources to be able to stand these things up on their own. And by being able to stand up these cloud infrastructures and standing up Hadoop and Hue and Pig and all of these different technologies and not even knowing what they do greatly increases the overall security risk for the organization. But because people are talking cloud and because they're talking DevOps, they're oversimplifying what is actually being done. The level of skill set that's required to stand this up across the IT industry as a whole is going down, because now only thing we need is a handful of people at Amazon that know how to get this working. They can make it something that you can then stand up and run very, very easily. But the skill sets to actually understand the technology stack and the skill set to be able to actually secure it is missing. So we have this collision of ease of use, ease of setup, and that's being coupled with the fact that the overall technical skills in the industry are going down. And that's just making things far easier for security testers and hackers to start breaking into them.
I tried to stand up a Hue interface for
Yeah.
demo. Oh my God. Very,
Yeah.
very complicated installation. So these
Oh,
are,
just doing
I
it from
made this
scratch,
point.
not on AWS, right?
Oh, oh my gosh. Yeah, it's very,
Yeah.
very challenging to do all those things.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Hey, Jordan, someone's asking, this question's been out there a while, did the default SG edited open up the Hue interface over the interface? I don't believe, right?
The current exposures on the internet, I think I mentioned this previously, you would have had to make mistakes up front, right? Your SGs would not be configured correctly. We exposed ours to our own IP blocks.
Yep.
It is not exposed by default. But again, this does not limit your risk as an organization. Has anyone ever clicked on an email and gained shell? Internal exposures, internal testing, right? We're pen testers. You drop us on your internal network, we give you a list of risks, right? So this is not generally exposed to the internet unless other mistakes were made.
Yep. Cool. So now there's some people that are like, oh, well,
this
could you
this
push
slide
down?
made me laugh. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Okay. So we'll get to that slide here in a second. Someone else mentioned AWS organizations could push down SCPs to control who can spin these up, at least lessen the wild, wild west a little. And I think that that's true right up until the point that we get to auto scaling groups. And I don't think we've talked about that much, Jordan. You were talking about how you could secure your Hue interface, add in a user ID and a password, take away that vulnerability. But what happens when it scales up and it adds in more to the cluster?
Oh, exactly. This is the problem, right? Scaling technologies in the cloud. You're monitoring your resources via automated functions. The best point of the cloud is automating everything you do, right? Writing code to do things, programmatically accessing things, staying out. You don't want people poking around your cloud, making changes constantly. You want to design software that does things for you. Thus, this risk. Every time some predefined threshold is hit, new clusters come online. If you're not securing your clusters via some other means, right? There's lots of documentation on the last slide of this that was provided by Zach from AWS. It's a serious, serious risk, right? You need to implement things like Kerberos or authorization. You've got to put these in containerized security groups. You've got to limit access in every possible way to these EMR clusters, wherever they are.
Yeah, what is this screenshot? I thought that this was kind of interesting. Some high security risks were detected.
I was investigating GetHue, right? As you see here, we're at gethue.com, and their front end shows a really cool screenshot. So some high risks were detected in Hue, and it reveals some soft spots in the product. So I laughed. I thought I'd throw it in. It's a risky product to deploy if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't have technical controls, and if you don't implement policies, procedures, gap analysis, all the things we are highlighting over and over and over and over.
So we've got a question from Glenn, and kind of a statement question. The issue is there are so many new tools and technologies coming out every year, and they aren't necessarily concerned about security, but speed to deployment. Also, not enough people are trained in new technologies or even know what they're doing on a deeper level, and I think that that's absolutely true. I also would add one more on top of that, where you can do everything right. You could go through and update PHP versions. You could add in a user ID and a password to Hue. But once again, whenever you have your technology start scaling up, you've got to run a scan when it's not scaled. And then when it starts scaling up, see if there's any differences in the way that that scan result comes back, and looking at those differences. Because in this situation, when it spins up new instances to scale up on demand, those instances can open you up to those vulnerabilities. But I think that still speaks to your point on complexity. They're very complex technologies. I think that cloud oversimplifies something that is incredibly complicated. And I know I'm an old man yelling at clouds, but it's, once again, we're running into this problem where things are getting more and more complicated, super easy to deploy really complicated things. Skill levels are going down. Technology is rapidly expanding. This means it's a great time to be a penetration tester. Jordan, anything to add on that as well, to that statement?
No, and you just said just about every single thing in this slide.
Oh, crap. Sorry.
And I don't know. It's absolutely beautiful because your point and my point are mirror, right? Great time to be a pen tester.
Well,
it's a terrifying time to be an implementer.
Here's the
Oh,
thing, Jordan, don't ever do on the internet what you don't really understand. And that's kind of an easy button, but if it sounds too good to be true, I mean, we try to hit the easy button all the time. Now
oh,
you
come
got
on.
to stay educated, and that's what we're trying to do. You got to look
I,
around.
I've got to be honest. I've been doing IT and IT security for almost 20 years, and at some point, all of the computers turn into black magic. And I just think about that quote from the new Spider-Man movie. It's like, what's going on? I don't know, but my professional opinion, witches, because it's just at some point it's magic, right? Now, can you talk a little bit about NCC Group's Scout?
Yeah, absolutely. These guys have done an incredible job. I think they just put Oracle stuff in beta. Maybe they're way ahead of me and I'm a month behind. But basically, NCC Group has written a tool that anyone with access to a set of keys, I'm going to take a step back in just a second. Anyone with a set of keys for programmatic access for any cloud service can run an audit and get basically an audit overview. The audit overview includes things like, are you running encryption on your S3 buckets? Do you have CloudTrail logging enabled? Is your Azure infrastructure meeting best practice standards as defined by vendor? So they have invested, I can't even imagine how many programming hours in making this tool. So if you are in the cloud, you need to look up NCC Group's Scout utility and run it. It absolutely cannot hurt. It does not violate any pen test standards as defined by any of these vendors because it is only asking for configuration data. There are tools designed to implement and execute escalation techniques on all the clouds, but this one is sort of a vulnerability scanner for your configuration of cloud resources. Use this, learn what it is, learn how it works, and do it. It's a beautiful utility. But now, taking the step back, I am searching your networks as an internal pen tester for credentials.csv files. When I find those, I will use Chris Gates, you mentioned earlier, his Weird Al tool. It is a privilege enumeration service. I find credentials.csv, I take them over to Weird Al, and I see what we can do in the cloud as the user whose credentials I discovered. PEM keys, don't leave PEM keys lying around. Search your network for .pem. Those are there. It's probably a risk to your organization. We are searching for them. You should be too. So just a couple other random things. These come up when you run Scout against AWS. Don't use hard-coded credentials in your Lambda functions. Learn what environmental variables are and how they work. Enable global CloudTrail audit logging. This basically enforces a protection against any configuration access to an API interface associated with your account. This should be on globally. Turn it on. Encrypt everything. It's a checkbox. There's no reason in Amazon for you to run volumes or EC2 instances on unencrypted EBS. There are reasons you wouldn't. Say you're not doing anything with the OS in a non-transient manner, right? Data is only passing through or similar, but still, it's a checkbox. S3 buckets, we will write you up as a finding for not encrypting your S3 buckets. Strengthen your password policies. Enforce MFA. These are traditional on-premise things we recommend that have moved to our non-traditional cloud infrastructure.
Yep.
Mirror all of them. If there is some way your coders are subject to policy and procedure on your traditional network, figure out how to map those to the cloud, right? We've got to solve these security problems. And from an executive perspective, it's policy, procedure, standards, guidelines. Gap analysis. I've said this about 20 times. I'm going to keep saying it. If you aren't doing it or you are doing it, have someone validate your gap analysis techniques. John, you also mentioned training, education, knowledge sharing. Figure out how to get your people trained in whatever cloud you've decided to push to. It matters and will impact you if you do not. Here's a
I
shout
will
out to
say,
somebody who, go ahead.
I was going to say, you've done some AWS training, right? Is there any
Yep.
training that you think is solid?
Just even the technical essentials Kelsey and I took last week, it's brilliant. I mean, it's brilliant for a base overview of how the cloud functions. It gives you a pretty good explanation of the shared responsibility model, how to deploy things, the number of services that are out there, what they are. I've also taken security operations on AWS. This is a brilliant course. It's 3 days, but for, you know, $2,000, you can't really beat all of that security operations best practices stuff that you don't have time to get reading documentation. Someone comes to you and says, hey, let's deploy this new thing. If you don't have some base level of understanding, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot, or as mentioned previously, here's the rope, go hang yourself, right?
Yep. The other thing I'd like to say is if we're trying to draw an analogy as far as where we're at, right now, I think that we're at with cloud technologies where we were back in 1999. If you remember in 99, if you just installed default Windows NT or Windows 2000 when it came out, it was riddled with vulnerabilities. You could basically walk into a Windows system very quickly and very easily. And even a lot of Linux applications, if you're deploying web servers, had hideous vulnerabilities out of the gate. And you know, Center for Internet Security started coming out with guidelines on configuration. And then, of course, SANS had their gold standards. I can't remember what SANS actually called it, but there was a lot of these books and these guidelines on how to configure and lock down your operating systems. And right now, we are in a situation where we have that exact same problem set, but for cloud technologies. The technology base is expanding so rapidly, and it's so complicated. And eventually, I suspect it will get better. But right now, it's a tremendous amount of due diligence, and trying to get that training is going to be key.
It is. And again, you bring back a point made earlier. Even AWS alone is at 5,000 unique services. How many did we look at today, John?
Oh, right.
Just one, right? So there's likely risks in anything you deploy. Taking a step back and saying, we need to learn, we need knowledge. We can't just immediately push our operations to the cloud.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm kind of a sucker for training, education, knowledge, documentation, but it also requires significant investment. And
so somebody was asking me for staff training and trying to do better at securing the cloud. Securosis, I just put out the link to everybody. Just an amazing, amazing team of people whenever it comes to cloud security, from Rich Mogul, Mike Rothman. Those are the two that I know very well. They're very good friends of ours, and we're also very proud customers of Securosis. And Rich Mogul has come out and spent some time with our team. So shout out to them. Be sure to check out their website. Just amazing, amazing resources.
Hey, Jordan, what was the training you took? What was the title on that? Was it 2 day?
the last one was AWS Technical Essentials. Both Kelsey and I took that. I would say it was a little probably basic for me, but I still wanted the cert associated with it, right? Because of paper chase, the whole world of, you know, maintaining partnerships, NDAs. There's some requirements that we maintain a certain level of certification. So that's a great course to start, and it's inexpensive. One day.
And AWS has this whole series of them, and
9, I think.
All
wasn't
good.
Wasn't Billy certified 8 out of 9 or 9 out of 9?
Billy Glenn is 9 for 9. He's one of the few people on the planet, probably.
And that's a constantly evolving game. So anyway, kind of what's the big deal? We talked about this. There's a lot of things exposed, and this was this morning. So 727 this morning. You know, what's the big deal? 250 probably exposed internal data sets, private clouds, Azure infrastructure, Oracle infrastructure. You know, I put a question mark next to Google Cloud here because I could not demonstrate the exact vulnerability on their infrastructure. That does not mean it doesn't exist. It just means that I struggled in my, you know, limited time to demonstrate that. But let's see where we are here. QA, contact, gratitude. We've had a lot of people reaching out and giving us love, so I want to give some back. You know, this is a fantastic community. John, great place to work. Thank you for the opportunity to learn all those things.
Also want to throw a huge shout out to the Amazon team. We've had a number of interactions with the AWS security team, and it has been nothing but pleasant. working with the Amazon AWS team on a couple of different issues. They really treat you like a partner, and their number one goal is to try to fix things. And they were an absolutely wonderful group to work with. And if you do have an opportunity to bring up a vulnerability, I know some vendors, who will not go named, are absolutely horrible to work with. They don't respond, then they belittle your finding, then they start threatening you, or they shut down access to your entire company. But Amazon doesn't work that way. And I really think that the AWS security team is kind of setting the beacon moving forward for trying to do this. And I will also finally say, do not expect that your cloud providers are going to prevent you from creating issues that hurt yourself. You've got to have that self-reliance and that self-responsibility for the security of your cloud infrastructures. So I think we're about ready to wrap it up, folks. Jordan, I think you have a slide after this with a whole crap ton of links.
Oh, I do. Yeah. We can talk through some of these real quick. Thank you for that reminder.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yep. Okay. So EMR releases, these are all links to some of the things I talked about, how to properly restrict. Let's like link number 3, how to properly restrict your EMR installations. The one above that, how to integrate EMR's initial deployment with your Kerberos infrastructure, some VPC configuration, private subnets through IAM, ways again to ensure that service spin-ups by software land in containers where you can be secure, right? So private subnet EMR, we got a link to Chris's stuff there, EyeWitness. There's the auto scaling guide. There's CloudWatch, how you configure CloudWatch, a link to Apache Spark because it's interesting. Submitting applications, right? You want to build a SQL interface, you want to do some things, you want to process data, Spark can help with that. The old Rapid7 module for the Hadoop unauthenticated execution, that's basically the RCE. I would assume that some of those exposed instances on the internet are subject to this. So patch, gap analysis, learn, read, best practices. I feel like I'm a broken record right now.
Is there a Weird Al tool link there?
I did. I just gave it out. I just responded and got it out.
Yeah, search your networks for credentials.csv. You might be interested in what you find. And again, Chris Gates' brilliant work in AWS over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, he has laid the groundwork for a whole lot of pen testers and a whole lot of security researchers on AWS.
All right.
And that tool, again, it's a privilege enumeration tool. So it will give you back a list of the things you can do, which you may find to be terrifying, right? If I can spin GPU instances in Amazon and burn, you're going to get a gigantic bill.
Somebody asked me to share our links on the Binary Defense website. We're not Binary Defense. Nothing but love for Dave Kennedy and Binary Defense. Our slides will not be on the Binary Defense website. Well, it could if they asked. We would put them there. And but no, it will be on the Black Hills Information Security website, and you will all get a notification once we have converted and we get the slides out. So it will absolutely be there. So
that's awesome.
All right, folks, let's wrap this up. Thank you so much for attending, everyone, and I hope you have a great day.
Agree. Thank you.